Thanks for tuning into this video. Today's lesson will look at the application of VBA. Now this particular problem that I've got is copying data from a data entry space into a database storage sheet, and so we simply need to be able to write some code or record a macro that will copy cells to a different sheet. Now, in this particular example, we're going to look at something that I've done many times, which is creating a data entry place for athletes to enter their daily wellness. Now, in this particular circumstance, you do not want people to see other athletes' information, and you do not want an athlete to see their own information from the previous day so that they're not influenced by anything else. So we create a data entry place, you have an upload button, and no one sees any of the data other than you. And so before we get started, I just want to validate these 7 fields. So the first one being name, we want this to be selected from a drop-down box. So on my control panel sheet, I've got a bunch of names. I'm going to use the name box to call that list names. Now on my data entry sheet, I can connect that on the data validation tab by choosing list and then either typing it in or using the F3 key to bring up a list of names. The F3 key doesn't work on a Mac, so typing it in is the method that I tend to use mostly. So I can now select an athlete. I might just blow that up a little bit more so that it stands out. Next one is date. I don't have a list for that, but I can control what gets entered in it. And so I'm simply going to use the calendar year as my data validation settings. So what that means now is that you can only enter a date in here. So I can't type a word in there, it won't allow that. I can only type dates. And so similarly, I want to make that a little bit more visible. The other thing that I actually want to do is choose a date format that means it doesn't matter whereabouts in the world you are. So in my side of the world you do day, month and year, but I know that's not the case everywhere. So instead of this, I'm going to type DDDD dash DD dash MM and then the 4 Y's. And so what that means is displayed above, actually it's got Friday the 1st of the 1st 2016. And so this means that there's no doubt as to the date that you've entered is what you wanted to enter. Up in the formula bar you can see this hasn't changed. There's no difference in format when you enter it, so you don't have to type Wednesday the 3rd or whatever. You just need to type date normally and it will be formatted a certain way for you. Body weight, decibel number between 40 and 180, and hours of sleep, decimal between 0 and 20, and these last 3 are all the same. Now I could choose to have them be just like we've previously done. For example, a say whole number between 1 and 10, or I could go to the control panel sheet and reference this list. So I could create a list of scores like so. You can call that whatever you like, and I could simply point that list to these 3 cells. So why don't I do that? And so we've got a drop down box now. I don't think it's particularly necessary, but certainly you can see that there's various options available. Just going to format all of these the same way, just a little bit bigger. And so let's get started by putting some information in here, then we can worry about how we can copy it across. So I've got some info in there. We want to get it to the format over on the database page. The thing that I want to do first is convert this to a table. Click on the Insert tab and then the table icon, and we've got our table in play now. Now there's no records in this table yet, but we'll put one in shortly. And so ideally what I want to happen is something like this. Copy the name, paste it in the name box, copy the date, paste it in the date box, and so on and so on. I just don't want to have to take that much effort. So let's figure out how we might record a macro to do that for us. When I was learning VBA, I tried to make things as simple as possible because it can take a little while to get your head around it. And the thing that I utilized when I created my first macro to do a task like this was to try and simplify it as much as possible. So I'm going to copy everything except column H's column heading. That's because that's a calculated field that we can do inside this table. Back on the data entry page, I'm going to paste values. You can see the font's quite small so that we can see it. And I'm going to do a direct cell reference to each of these cells. And what we can see now is that anytime that something in these 7 data entry cells changes, it also changes up in this little sort of helper panel that we've created. I would normally have this section on another sheet, but so that it's hidden away, but to have it here helps the learning process. Now we're going to record a macro. If you don't have a developer tab, then you need to go to the File, Options, Customize Ribbon, and tick the developer tab. You can see mine's ticked here already. If you don't have it and you do that, you should now have a developer tab, and you can use this button that says Record Macro. Before we record that macro, just want to step through what the tasks are. The first thing is that we have to copy the data, then go to the database sheet, find the correct row to paste into, paste the data, come back here, clear the cells out, and leave the cursor in the correct cell so that the next person can go straight into it. Let's have a go at this. Click on the Record Macro button. It comes up with the default name of macro 1. Let's change that. Big long name that I've put there. You don't obviously need to do that. Macro 1 would have been fine. It's just easier when you're trying to understand a whole lot of macros that you've written if you've got a descriptive name. You could also write a description here that would help you. For example, this is part of video number 73. As soon as I click OK, it's going to start recording, and you can tell that because now instead of record macro, it says stop recording up in the top part of the toolbar. Select the cells we want. Hit Control C for copy. Go to the database sheet. We now have to find the correct row to paste into. Now, I could just put it in cell A3 and click paste, but next time we do this, it'll be cell A4 because we'll have another row already in the database. So we have to find the correct row in a little bit more of a robust way. So to do so, I'm going to go to cell 18,000 by typing that into the name box. That takes me down to cell 18,000. Next, I turn on the button that says Use Relative References. Keyboard shortcut Control up arrow. That takes me up until it bumps into some data. So it stops when it meets the last row in the column. That's currently row 2. I go down one more row because that's the first blank row. And on the Home tab, I choose Paste Values. I now select the data entry page. On the Developer tab, I turn off Use Relative References, and I simply select and then delete each of the 7 data entry fields, finishing with the name box, because if I finish there, I've automatically accomplished my final task, which is to select the name cell and leave that as the cell that's selected already, waiting for the next person. You can see across on the right hand side all of our helper area cells say 0. Click stop recording and we're done. Let's have a go at putting in some more information and see if it works for us. Just randomly selecting some values. Let's right click on this box, it's just a shape, and assign the macro that we just wrote. It's in this workbook and it's called Copy to Database with VBA option 1. Click OK. So now whenever we hover over this button, you can see it turns to a hand. That means it's ready to execute some code. If you had a hyperlink like a web address or an email address, that hand would also appear. Let's give this a go. Click it. Something happened because we can see all the cells are now empty. We can go to the database sheet and we can see that what's also happened is it's pasted the data incorrectly, so we're doing really well. What we haven't got is our average wellness value in play. I'll delete that incomplete row for now, and then I can write the formula in. Alright, that looks good. Let's add another record just to make sure we got it right. Click upload, check it out, and that's pasting in correctly. And so if we check out what the code looks like, it might help us with our learning process. Our file's called EAF VBA Data Entry System, and there's an area that says modules. If I open that up, click module 1, this is the code that recorded all of our steps. So I'm going to put some spaces in here to break up the different parts of our code. If I want to write any comments, they'll appear in green, but only if I put an apostrophe before I start writing. So here we are, it's copying cells H2 to N2 by first selecting them. So for example, if I wanted to add another variable to our data entry, I could simply fix up my helper area and change that, for example, to column O. Don't want to do that just yet. Next, we want to go to the database and find the row. First line selects the sheet. The next line selects cell A10,000. This is just recorded that we scrolled up. Don't need that at all. But what it does is it goes Control up arrow and selects the last row of the database. Copy this up, that belongs there. It then goes down one row to the first available row. So that's what offset 10 means. If I click inside it, it's asking for how many rows do I go down, how many columns do I go across. So 1 row down, 0 columns across. This part here merely is a feature relating to Excel tables. If you didn't have a data set that used the table, this little part wouldn't have been recorded. This does a command which is very simple, paste special values. Now I haven't put an apostrophe in here, and if I hit enter, the font will turn red. That's because VBA has questioned what this line is. It thinks it's a piece of code, but it doesn't know what it's supposed to be doing. Turns it red, and it won't allow you to do anything now until I put a little apostrophe before it, and now it goes green and it's okay. Now we're simply back on the data entry sheet, and it's selecting one at a time, B15, B13, B11, B9, B7, B5 and B3, and clearing them out. And so that's a pretty simple setup and effectively working and doing what we want. So that's great. We have recorded, done a little bit of editing, and we've got our macro to work, and we can use this macro over and over now to copy and paste data to our database. We could hide this. For example, we could make it white, and you wouldn't even know it's there. And so for years I was happy with that. I didn't bother myself learning and getting better and better at VBA to make that process be a bit slicker. And I think in your case you can decide how you want to go about this. If you want to make it a little bit better, then you can. And so we're going to have a look at that, both from a perspective of making the data entry sheet better from a sports science perspective, but also from the perspective of having cleaner and more efficient VBA. And so we recorded that first procedure. That's what people call a macro. Macro is something you record. You might do a bit of editing to it, but essentially Excel has done the work for you in terms of writing the code. And so I'm in the VBA window now. This is the macro that we recorded, and it's called Module 1 at the moment, but why don't I choose a new title by typing down here simply Option 1. In Module 2 I've pasted in some code that I baked in advance. Now rather than writing it with you, I simply want to explain what's happening. This is still quite inefficient code, but just like previously it works, and it's taking a step forward in the VBA writing process. How is it different? Well, for a start, up the top we are declaring and assigning some variables. So we are telling Excel that DE is how we want to refer to our data entry sheet. So I'm telling Excel that DE is a worksheet. I'm telling it that DB is a worksheet as well. That's our database sheet. And that PR is a variable that is of type long. So long means it could be a big number. Let's say we use this for a few years and it gets up to row 10,000. Long is a big number that is whole, so it's not a decimal. So long is just the type. I could have called it integer, like so, but in this particular case it doesn't really matter. Then what I'm doing is I'm telling it that data entry is sheet 5. Now if you look on the left here, sheet 5 is our data entry sheet. We've called it data entry, but Excel sees it as sheet 5. So a little bit of a subtlety there, but it's worth understanding that. Database is sheet 1, and the first thing that we want to do is find out what our paste row is. We've called that PR. And so we do, just like when we recorded it, we go to the database, we go to cell A10,000, we go control up arrow, offset 10, and we get the row number. That's what .row means, and we record that as PR. And so every time that we are pasting something, we can be referring to PR. And now what I've done after that, like I said, relatively inefficient, but it works quickly and you'd hardly notice it, is I've copied the contents of cell B3 on the data entry sheet. I've gone to the database sheet and I've pasted it. This is the name. Name is in column 2, so we're pasting it in the row PR, column 2. Then we're going back to the data entry and we're getting the next item, in this case date, and then the next one, body weight, sleep hours, sleep quality, soreness, then stress, and then we're going and clearing all the cells out just like we did previously. So that works pretty well also. Let's test it out, firstly by assigning it to this button. So I've got an inconsistent name here, apologies for that. Database copy option 2 is what I've called this pasted piece of code. Let's go down to the bottom, choose someone else, and get some data in here. Moment of truth is to click the upload button for option 2 and see what happens. So it seemed to take just a little bit longer, but it worked. Let's go and check. Everything copied across as it should. Why did it take a bit longer, or appear to take a little bit longer? Well, that's because it had to select each sheet about 8 times. First it had to select the database sheet to find the last row, then it had to come back and copy the name, then go to the database, paste it, come back. So it's going backwards and forwards several times, and that's quite inefficient. It would be way better if it didn't have to go backwards and forwards. So we accomplish that with our recorded macro by simply having a helper area off to the side, or we could do it on another sheet. But actually VBA doesn't require you to select those cells, doesn't require you to select the sheets and go backwards and forwards. You can simply write a few lines that will reference the cells on one sheet to the cells on another sheet. So let's check out what that code looks like. So I've got that written up here. The first part is exactly the same as what we looked at with option 2. We've declared some variables, we've set some values against those variables, so the sheet names, we've identified the last row, but instead of having quite a lot of code, this is the code that references the database sheet to the data entry sheet. And so you can see each item on the data entry page only requires a single line of code. Then we go through and clear out all of the data entry cells. You could even do that in a different way as well to make it more efficient. You could do a single line of code to clear all those data entry cells out, but I haven't worried about that. Why don't we have a look at that piece of code now? First we assign it to the button, right click, assign macro, option 3. Get some data in here. And let's try it out. Click option 3's button. So that happened pretty fast. So you can see, even though it was really only probably half a second difference, that it happened a lot quicker. There's another thing that we can do. I'm going to show you that now. I'm going to go to this sheet. This is for option 3. I'm going to type application. As soon as I hit dot, there's going to be a little menu appear. These are all the things that I might do referencing the application. When I hit equals, it gives me what I want to see as either false or true. If I select false, I copy that row, and down the bottom select true. That turns it back on again. What does it turn back on? Well, it turns off the screen flicker and then turns it back on again at the end. So let's just check that out. Once again, get some data in there. Now if we click the upload option button 3, we can see there wasn't a screen flicker. It all happened a bit faster, and it didn't seem like our computer was melting down. So that screen updating can be quite useful if you're flicking between sheets or updating charts or something like that with code. If you want a copy of this file, then feel free to send me an email at the address that hopefully is just flashed up on the screen. This is definitely a useful skill to persevere with. If you can get yourself started with VBA, you'll find you can accomplish some pretty great things. There will be a little bit of heartache along the way. There are a couple of great YouTube channels that will take you start to finish through the VBA learning process. One of them that I rate particularly highly is called Wise Owl, and I've watched many of their videos myself. So check it out if you are interested. And also, if you want to learn a little bit more about some advanced Excel methods for training athletes and so on, you might consider checking out some of these Vimeo courses that you'll see in the description, and there's a discount for you if you want to take that up. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you soon with another video.